Okay, good evening everyone. Welcome to October's North Canberra Community Council General Meeting, which also includes an AGM. The first guest presentations tonight are both Vicki Dunne and Marcus Hipkins as well. Vicki Dunne is Liberal member for Ginninderra, Speaker of the Assembly, and she will be enlightening us on what the role of the Speaker is. So let's give a warm welcome to Vicki, please.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you very much, and thank you to the North Canberra Community Council for this opportunity to speak about the Assembly and the importance of the Assembly, and from my perspective as the Speaker. I'm coming here as the Speaker to be as apolitical as possible because that's my job, although I am in a slightly unusual position because because I was the first person, I think, ever in a Westminster Parliament elected from the opposition to be a Speaker. There has been, I'm now in the august company of Bruce Atkinson, who was the President of the Victorian Upper House, who was also, after the last Victorian election, re-elected as Speaker, although he was an opposition member. It's an unusual position for someone to be in, and I contrast it with the House on the Hill with 149 members, and I think the Speaker has the support of the majority of something in excess of 40 members, so that anyone ever challenges the Speaker, she had, and he now has, a whole party of people behind him who will support him. But because I rely on the votes across the board, and there is no majority of votes in the Legislative Assembly in any one grouping, I have to I'm really on my mettle, and I think it puts me in a great position to ensure that the role of the Speaker is as impartial as possible. That creates a few interesting things for me as a Speaker. I sometimes, when I first became Speaker, my father said to me, "What would you do that for? In a small parliament like that, why would you give up your vote?" But the Speaker of the Legislative Assembly doesn't give up their vote. They have a deliberative vote, unlike the Speaker of the House of Representatives. And it's more like the Senate. The President of the Senate doesn't give up his vote. He has a deliberative vote because it was viewed that the Speaker, the President of the Senate was a representative of a state, in this case Tasmania, and by taking away his deliberative vote, that would deprive that state of a vote. And so, in multi-member electorates, I think the same situation applies. That by taking away that vote, you would actually reduce the voting power in a sense of the electors. In this case, of Ginninderra. So, I have a deliberative vote, but sometimes I feel quite uncomfortable casting that vote because it means that I'm not being absolutely impartial. From time to time I will cast a vote along party lines, and it just does make me feel a little uncomfortable. For most times, and most things that go through the Legislative Assembly go through without a vote, because most of what happens in the Legislative Assembly is generally supported by both sides. You only really hear about the things which are controversial, where the parties or groupings within the Assembly are divided on the issue. But sometimes it does make me think about, it would be nice to perhaps not have to have a deliberative vote. I think that the role of the Speaker is a very important one, and it has a long tradition that goes back well into the sort of formative days of Parliament. Remembering that we in the Legislative Assembly here in the ACT, as with all parliaments in Australia, we have a Westminster-style Parliament which is adversarial in many ways. But I think that adversarial approach does give us lots of opportunities. I think it is a better system than, say, the United States system, where the executive is not drawn from the Parliament, and I think it creates certainty. It creates a level, and in this modern age, a level of accountability that I think that we don't see in other parliaments. But accountability is a very important thing as far as I'm concerned, and it's always been something that I've been very, very keen to develop. And I think that in the ACT we have a lot of the structures that allow us accountability, and I think that we also have a lot of structures which I'm able to, as in my capacity as speaker and as in other roles, share with other people. One of the important roles that we have is that most of the parliaments of Australia are members of the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association, which is a grouping of Commonwealth countries who have a Westminster-style parliament, and generally speaking, but not exclusively, traditional colonial links with the UK. Commonwealth Parliamentary Association is 54 countries and about 170 parliaments, including subnational parliaments, and it's an organisation which is a little over 100 years old, and its particular role is to encourage the development of good parliamentary institutions. And we in Australia have very close relations with our Pacific neighbours, and we work very closely with the New Zealand Parliament and the other Australian parliaments to bring useful institutions and help to build up the institutions of Parliament in the Pacific. Caroline Lakuta and I, a few years ago, I think 2011, 2012, had the opportunity to visit Kiribati, which is the parliament that the ACT Legislative Assembly is twinned with, and to see firsthand how a small Pacific nation struggles with all the things that a poor, and it is a poor Pacific nation, struggles with, and how that impacts on how they run their democracy. And it was an eye-opening experience to look at the urban crowding in what looks like a beautiful place, but it creates a situation where this beautiful island in a lagoon which looks pristine and bright, vibrantly blue is impossible to swim, because of the urban crowding and the pollution that comes from that, the water shortages, the real struggle that they have to provide great services for their community. And I think the thing that sticks in my mind, I'm sure it does in Caroline's mind, was the opportunity we had to visit a school for disabled children, which was unlike anything that you would experience here. It was a ramshackle, run-down place it was hot and crowded, and there were lots of children there. It was obviously a place of great love and respect and resourcefulness. And I think that not only do we now support the Parliament of Kiribati, but we also support that particular school through donations of toys and equipment and sort of really basic things that we take for granted here in Australia. And that's part of my role, is to keep up those relations and to ensure that the work that we do here can also benefit people elsewhere. And we keep up that relation with the Kiribati Parliament. We, through this Parliament, train their parliamentarians in post-election seminars, and we provide resources and ongoing training for their staff, especially in their Public Accounts Committee, which I think is one of the most important aspects of ensuring openness and accountability in a parliamentary system. To be able to scrutinise the government and its spending is extraordinarily important, and most parliaments in Australia and across the Westminster system have a version of a Public Accounts Committee whose job it is to sort of keep the government honest through looking at their accounts and how they spend their money. I think that there are many things that we have as firsts in the ACT Legislative Assembly, and some of them are really quite admired and elsewhere, and many people are interested in emulating In the ACT, under the previous Speaker, there was a move to create a sort of a separate, to really sort of establish the separateness of the Legislative Assembly from the Executive, and that through the passage of legislation we created the Legislative Assembly as a separate entity which has its own budget, so that when the government appropriates money in the budget process, it's not just another line in the budget, it is a separate standalone item. And there are a few mechanisms that ensure that the government takes the Parliament seriously. We have, in the process of establishing the budget, I make recommendations as the Speaker, make recommendations to the government about what the appropriation for the Legislative Assembly should be. I don't do that by myself, I'm advised by the Clerk and our Public Accounts Committee. No, sorry, not our Public Accounts Committee, another, the Standing Committee on Administration and Procedure. And there's a backwards and forwards conversation between essentially the members of the Legislative Assembly, the people who run the Legislative Assembly, and I make a recommendation based on that advice to the government. Now, if the government chooses not to accept my advice about what the extent to which the Legislative Assembly should be funded, they have to account for it. They have to actually come into the Assembly and say, well, the Speaker asked for this much money, but we're giving you something less, and these are the reasons. It's not perfect, but I've come to the conclusion that ministers and treasurers don't particularly like having to come into the Assembly and saying we're not giving you the money that you asked for because we're feeling mean on the day. However, I have been knocked back, and I have been knocked back on things that I think are very important. The last budget I asked for money to provide for a dedicated security officer on the back of a security assessment, and also on the back of the advice that we received following the incident in the Canadian Parliament, that we really did need to ramp up our security for the safety of the people who work in and around the building. The government decided that that wasn't a priority for them, but I will be going back because it is a priority for me. I think I have a responsibility for the people who work in the building, and that's not just members, that's staff of members, and also public servants who service the Legislative Assembly through committees and libraries and the like. The thing that the government was prepared to spend some money on is an upgrade of the Legislative Assembly. We're about to start, the builders are in, doing preliminary works because, as you know, the next election we're going to receive another 8 new members. You know, a 42% increase in the size of the Legislative Assembly in a very small building does create some problems for us, and the plan which is in place at the moment is to remove some of the staff who are not members or member staff, so the Hansard staff, the people who pay the accounts and people like that from the building, and to free up some space, and we're going to have to create 8 new offices. It's a slightly complicated thing because we don't know exactly how many ministers and therefore how many non-executive members there will be. It's how many officers you put on the top floor, which is the ministerial floor, and how many put on the middle floor, which is the non-executive floor. It's a bit of a quandary, and of course we have a chief minister at the moment, but he may not be the chief minister after the next election, and it's in the purview of the chief minister to say how many ministers he has, so long as it's 9 or less. I did have a conversation with the chief minister and the leader of the opposition and said, well, come on, tell me, how many ministers do you think you might have? They weren't very forthcoming on that, so I have to guess. So we made an educated guess, and we're about to start on a major refurbishment. Well, actually no, it's a very modest refurbishment. I'm still arguing with the government about whether they will give us some money to upgrade some of the toilets, which are not part of the refurbishment, because, and also to upgrade some of the heating and cooling in the building, because it's a 45-year-old building with a 25-year-old refurbishment in it, and some of the heating and cooling is not great, and it's not very cheap to run, and if we're going to have a whole lot of builders in and a whole lot of work done, it probably makes sense to bring forward some of the other expenditure that we should have done over the time to make sure that we spend a bit of money now but save a bit of money in the long term and probably make the building a bit more efficient. But that's a very modest project. It's coming in at $6.1 million to create a 42% increase in the capacity of the Legislative Assembly, which also means we'll have to redesign the chamber a little, because currently there is seating for 23 members and we have to move that up to 25 members. And we're looking at a couple of options, but that will be a very minor part of the bill. Look, I could talk all night about being the Speaker. I could talk underwater about being the Speaker. But I think I should, I'm conscious of the time, I'm conscious that you've got other presenters and you're having an AGM. But if people want to ask any questions, I'm happy to ask questions about speakering type things.
Okay, let's open it up.
Open it up.
Having only been in the Legislative Assembly during business about once, don't have a very broad knowledge of what happens in there. Have you got any anecdotes of interesting things that happen in there that you are able to tell us?
Oh, well, everything that happens in the chamber is on the public record, so there are no secrets. I've been a member since 2001, and I'm the mother of the house, not the father of the house. But Simon Corbell is the father of the house, and Brendan Smith comes up quite close behind him in terms of seniority. I think it's very interesting actually to sit in the Speaker's chair, because you get a very different perspective on how things work. You know, I've sat in various spots around the chamber as a member, but when you sit up a little bit higher and you sort of see everyone equally, I think it's very interesting to see how it goes. The Leader of the Opposition doesn't like me at question time because I tend to warn him and bring him to book quite a lot, but that's because he's a noisy beggar and doesn't know when to stop interjecting. I haven't yet thrown anybody out, although my colleague Mr Dospot over here, who did you throw out?
Current Chief.
The current Chief Minister. He was the Chief Minister at the time, that's right. In this term, sorry, I have thrown someone out, but not when I was Speaker. I threw someone out in the previous Assembly for very bad behaviour. I tend to take the view that and I don't want to, it's a very small room with a small number of people in it. I tend to take the view that if I made people sit there in silence and listen to everyone, it would be really tedious, and everyone would hate it. So I take the view that there should be a certain amount of interplay of interjection, and some people can cope with interjection a whole lot better than others. Simon Corbell can talk over anybody. He just keeps on keeping on. Jeremy Hansen is the same. I've noticed that the Chief Minister finds it he seems to find it quite disruptive sometimes, and I have to be alert to that, so that if someone's interjecting over him, he tends to sort of not get flustered or anything, but I think he probably loses his train of thought. So you have to be mindful of that. And I do spend a lot of time calling people to order. Mr Dospot a lot. I think he sits far enough away from me that he doesn't necessarily hear when I call people to order. And also he has a voice that, although it's somehow seems very gentle, it travels extraordinarily well, so he often gets into trouble when other people are often a good deal noisier than he is, but he has a voice that sort of seems to travel over it all. I think that the really interesting things that I see as the Speaker is the sort of interplay, because the government, surprisingly, didn't support my election as Speaker, and they had their own candidate, and from time to time you see that it really rankles if I make a ruling that they don't like, and you'll see, especially Simon Corbell will sort of be wanting to have a go, and then there'll be people around him going, no, don't do it. And occasionally they'll go, yeah, and you know that he's going to be up, and you see people's body language. Simon stands, and he buttons his collar, his jacket, and and he puts his hand in his pocket, and you know when he puts his hand in his pocket, he's really get on for you. and it's very interesting, and various people have really sort of telltale sort of body language, but Simon Paul in particular has great body language. I love it. Jeremy Hansen has not so much great body language, but a somewhat colourful turn of phrase, sometimes too colourful for the chamber, and he has been brought to book on a number of occasions. But some of the things for which he's been brought to book are in fact unparliamentary, and I couldn't possibly repeat them here. So, anything else?
Just a
Yes.
comment. I find that the website for the Assembly really useful, and it's got lots of really interesting features. And for anyone that's interested in pursuing that parliamentary language thing, it's very helpfully laid out all in Hansard, where you can look up all sorts of things.
But sometimes you have to remember that what's unparliamentary, it's all in context. You know, that sometimes if you use bad words, that's unparliamentary. Yeah, but sometimes people get, oh, that's unparliamentary, and I think you have to. Every ruling has to be in context, because sometimes someone will say, oh, that was ruled unparliamentary by so and so, and you think, I don't know what the context was there, but you know, my judgment is that that was fair game. And often, I'm very loath to sort of declare words are unparliamentary unless they use bad words. Yes.
I might be naive, but wouldn't it be a good idea to appoint a public servant to be Speaker, completely neutral, and who has the skills to?
Well, there's two models of speakerdom, and that's not one of them. It is quite common in parliaments, a lot of African parliaments and most Caribbean parliaments, and in the Pacific, the Parliament of the Cook Islands, where the Speaker is not an elected member of Parliament, that is appointed from outside. But sometimes that person is really someone who's been appointed by the Prime Minister or the Chief Minister or whomever. So that doesn't necessarily make them impartial either. I think the thing that makes you impartial is, well, it's your intent to be impartial. And for me, in the Legislative Assembly, if I weren't impartial, I'd be out of that job. I mean, I would be out of that job so fast your eyes would bleed. Because someone
I'm thinking more someone like a magistrate or...
Well, a retired magistrate, magistrates are busy people. And I mean, I don't know, I suppose I'm a traditionalist, but I'm not entirely sure. I mean, there are other responsibilities as well, which are administrative, and so perhaps a public servant could do it, but it would have to be someone of reasonable status. And for instance, the former Speaker of the Cayman Islands Parliament, probably not a good example of that. But she was a magistrate, but a retired magistrate, and there are many examples like that. But that would be, we in Australia don't have a tradition of appointing people from outside Parliament, and our constitution doesn't allow for it. Yes.
I presume there's a question time.
Yes, 2:30 on every sitting day.
Can you throw any light on why it's not reported very well?
Well, I think you'd probably have to ask the Canberra Times that.
Yeah.
I think that if there's sometimes it is, but I mean we don't broadcast.
No.
We don't broadcast. Well, there's no major broadcaster. 2XX used to broadcast it, but they kept it used to be broadcast simultaneously, essentially, and then they sort of kept bouncing it around. And we've looked at broadcasting question time and the adjournment debate with community radio stations. But
what about on the web?
But it is on the web. It is all webcast, so that if you go to the web page.
So can we surmise that the question time doesn't get very meaty?
Look, I think it does sometimes, and I think that. And the thing is, I think that it's a fiction that people think that it is theatrical. It is the most theatrical time. Everyone's in the chamber. There's lots of interplay across the chamber, more so than when you're debating a bill or something like that. It is theatrical, and it is a time for sort of trying to drill into things. And we have a pretty good question time, because it's not just one question and you move on to the next thing. We have a structure where you ask a principal question and then there are up to 3 follow-up questions on the subject. And that means that you can drill into a subject quite, and if you thought that it was really important, you could ask 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 questions, which might give you 24 questions on the same subject. So you can really drill into a subject. But things, it's not theatrical in the way that the federal parliament is, and that's really a function of size. But we do sort of cover sort of meaty issues, and where you'll cover the budget. There'll be Dorothy Dix's about what the government is doing and how. Can you please tell us more about the government's policy on blah? But there's a lot of and quite diverse questioning from the opposition. There used to be from the crossbench, but we don't have a non-executive crossbench at the moment. There's always been a fairly active question time. Yeah. And you can see it on the webcast.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, hello. Hi, my name's Max. Good evening. Nice to meet you.
How are you, Max?
As an observation, generalisation, as a non-politician, I definitely regard myself as a non-politician. I find federal parliamentarians and politicians in particular, and possibly to some extent ACT, I'm not familiar enough with that, very adversarial. I mean, the system is meant to be adversarial,
yes,
but is there any thought sometimes being given to being more collaborative, rather than having this theatrical business that you just referred to, which really it's nice to watch perhaps, but it doesn't really get the job done at the end of the day, because a lot of time and energy is spent on being theatrical and adversarial.
Well, I think that there's gradations of adversarialness in any parliament, in the Legislative Assembly in particular. So that the sort of the high point is probably question time, or in that probably 5% of quite controversial bills where there is real disagreement on one side and the other about the merit of a particular proposition. For the rest of the time, I think that there is a high degree of agreement. We have a fairly well-working committee system where...
So these are some, sorry to interject, these are some of the things that maybe the general public doesn't necessarily see.
But I think actually that one of the great strengths of the Australian parliamentary system is an effective committee system where people from across the parties come together to look at a particular issue, and it might be a planning issue or a health issue, or it might be scrutinising a piece of legislation. And for the most part, people tend to sort of leave their sort of political hat at the door. John Hargraves used to say, we leave our hat at the door and you come in as a parliamentarian, not a politician. Doesn't always work, but it often does. And then you'll find people sort of, seriously investigating and inquiring into things. I think the committee system is
so a lot more collaboration goes on.
Is a lot more collaborative there, but also a lot of the legislation passes in a highly collaborative way. That a government might introduce a piece of legislation, and an opposition member or a crossbench member may say, well, this is all right, but what about this? And they'll negotiate, and often, it sort of depends. The government may say, I'll introduce an amendment to fix that up, or you can introduce an amendment to fix that up to give you the kudos for it, and that we'll support it. And it sort of depends. Sometimes it's complex and it's better that the government does it because there's less chance of unintended consequences, because there are more people scrutinising what happens. Whereas
so what we see, what the media picks up is often only the tip of the iceberg.
Yes, yeah, and I mean the Assembly sits for about 80, 90 days a year, but on top of that, most weeks every committee meets for 1 or 2 hours doing other work which they don't see. Sometimes that's because they're in private hearings, sometimes they're in public hearings, but the media is not going to cover it unless it's juicy, unless somebody's coming there to bag out the government or something like that.
Well, thanks for explaining that.
That's all right. I'm conscious of your time, but I'm happy to take another couple of questions if there are any.
Vicki, I thought it might be interesting just to talk about unicameral versus multi-house.
This is Clinton White, he's my senior advisor. Clinton's awesome, and Chris, who works in my office, is also awesome. But Clinton Yeah, okay, it is actually useful to sort of make the point that unlike the federal parliament, we are a unicameral system, so that everything, and that's why, although my party is not, would never endorse this, I'm a great fan of the fact that the Hare-Clark system turns up hung parliaments a lot in the ACT, because without, you know, a House of Review, you know, convincing 9 or 17 people that something's a good idea may not necessarily be the best idea for the community. And when you have a hung parliament and an effective, engaged crossbench and an opposition, you get a whole lot of different perspectives on things, and they are often translated into, you know, measures that the government may take, because the government has to go cap in hand to negotiate the passage. When there's an active crossbench in particular, they have to go cap in hand to negotiate the effective passage of every piece of legislation. And so you don't have that scrutiny from another house, but you have much larger checks and balances in the chamber itself. So I've always been an advocate of hung parliaments.
Actually, that reminds me of something that I've also wondered about. Most, well, nationally as well, but most states either have a governor or a governor-general, that kind of position, and we don't.
No.
So, I mean, we haven't had some major constitutional crisis here, but how does one actually determine, you know, let's say, who is the government or who isn't the government? Or...
Well, the government is determined by, the Chief Minister is determined by a ballot of the chamber. I mean, it works pretty much the same way. What happens in the federal parliament is that you have an election, and the person who wins the majority or the largest number of votes is given an opportunity to form a government, and then they report to the Governor General that they can or can't form a government. And we don't do that. What we do here is say, well, we have a ballot, it's a secret ballot, and we elect someone who is the Chief Minister now. If it was a majority government, well, that's sort of obvious. But if there's a large crossbench and no majority in the government, that means that person is reliant on maintaining good relations with the crossbench for that to happen. And usually someone will say, well, I'll support you for confidence and supply, that is, I'll keep you as Chief Minister and I'll assure the passage of your budget, and everything else is up for grabs.
Actually, now I'm thinking what it was. It was the Northern Territory. It wasn't even cross-party. It was internal within the party.
Oh, yeah.
And that was a very messy
well, that was just
situation.
Done,
so, but I was curious, though, is there someone who actually makes that decision?
Well, in the ACT, we are more of a republic than anywhere else.
But wouldn't it be the Minister for Territories?
No. If the Parliament ceases to be functional, the Governor General can dissolve the ACT Legislative Assembly, but he would have to be absolutely satisfied that they were a complete basket case to do that. I think because it would be, you know, it's not a reserve power; it's a very obvious power. But I think he'd be fairly reluctant to do that. The thing that happened in the Northern Territory was that there were a few people in the ruling party who decided they didn't want the Chief Minister and came together and had a vote, but they didn't have everybody in the room and didn't even have the decency to ring some of the people. So they had a vote of a Core 8 meeting, but it wasn't everybody. And then they expected the Chief Minister to resign, and he just didn't blink, and he didn't resign. And they apparently went to Government House and said, to see the administrator, and said, well, I've just been elected the leader of the LNP, and the administrator said, well, where's the previous Chief Minister's resignation? Oh, well, we don't have that. You're just another parliamentarian until the Chief Minister resigns, and the Chief Minister didn't resign. So yeah, that was a little unfortunate. But we have a slightly different approach.
So there's no administrator here?
No, there's no administrator. The administrator is the Governor General.
The Hare-Clark system has that great advantage, but the disadvantage to us is we don't have a local member on really local issues. You don't feel you've got 5 members, and they all sort of, well, perhaps someone else will deal with this. Hopefully.
Oh well, I think that I think that that's I'm sure that Mr Dostrot doesn't think that. I don't live in this area. I live in Belconnen and I'm in Ginninderra. I take the view that I've got, there might be 5 members, but I can't divvy up and say I'll have these 20,000 over here and leave the other 80,000 for the other 4 members. I'm there for everybody. Sometimes you are spread a bit thin, and that Alastair Coe and I often work together and say, well, you know, you'll cover that and I'll cover this sort of thing.
But it's hard when they're all in the executive.
Well, yes, yes.
You know, who are you going to get for a local issue? You know, you're trying to get the streets swept or something.
Well, excuse me.
You can talk to Dossie.
If I can just answer that, they're not all in the executive. You've got 7 local members. You've got 3 Labor members who are all in the executive. You've got,
Megan Fitzharrison.
oh, sorry,
No, she's not.
sorry.
recent.
Yeah.
But you've got 3 Labor representatives. Normally 3 of them have been executive. You've got Shane Green, who's in the executive, but you have got 3 on our side who don't have executive roles, and all 3 of us are pretty active in the community. If you ever want to have, all I need is a telephone call, and I'll talk to you on whatever issue you want to talk about, unless you're selected without you.
Yeah, I mean, I have an issue generally that, you know, the government wants to move to densification, right? But it doesn't want to do what any other city that has densification does, you know, in terms of services. You know, I mean, I live inner north, and you know, we get our streets swept once every 6 months, and the result is that inside our apartment is dusty all the time. You know, if we open the windows, we have to really run the air conditioning full time if we want, because the streets get just filthy. And you know, we try to do our best, the locals do, but you can't. I lived in Melbourne, and the street sweeper went down our street in Chadstone, way out in the middle of nowhere, every week, and we get it twice a year. And those sort of services have to be catered to densification. If you're going to have densification, you've got to provide the services. You've got the money from heaps of people living.
Well, if I can just answer that.
No, hang on, no. This is my bit.
Okay, and after Vicki speaks, that's it, okay? No, seriously, I'm looking at the time now.
I take your point.
I still think it's a disadvantage of the hair clerk system.
Well, yeah.
In Melbourne, they would get their local member or their local councillor and nail that person and say, what are you going to do about it?
Well, I get street swept in Belconnen, but I'm happy to represent you to get your streets swept as well, even if you're not in my.
Okay, and on that note, that's all. Thank Vicki for. No worries, thanks a lot.
Thank you very much for your time.